Ladies and gentlemen, we live in a world that constantly praises the virtues of being good. Good in behavior, good in morality, good in service to others. From childhood, we are taught to obey, to please, to conform. Yet few ever pause to ask, at what cost does this constant pursuit of goodness come? Schopenhauer, who saw life as driven by an endless will to survive and struggle, warned us that behind every ideal lies suffering. And Kierkegaard, in his insistence on authentic existence, revealed that living merely to satisfy the demands of the crowd is to betray one's own soul. When we make goodness our highest aim without awareness, we risk losing ourselves. The desire to be endlessly good often becomes a cage where we no longer act from authenticity but from fear. Fear of rejection, fear of disapproval, fear of confronting the darker aspects of our humanity. We wear the mask of virtue, but behind it simmers resentment, exhaustion, and despair. Schopenhauer would remind us that the world does not reward pure goodness. Instead, it often exploits it. Those who give without limits are drained by those who take without gratitude. Those who try to live without conflict are crushed by those willing to impose their will. In the end, the pursuit of constant goodness often leads not to peace, but to suffering, the kind that gnaws silently, unacknowledged, because it hides beneath a smile. Kierkegaard would say this: to live only for the approval of others, to define oneself only by the role of the good person, is to live in despair, for true goodness is not a mask, but a truth that emerges when we dare to stand authentically before God, before life, before ourselves. Therefore, the question is not whether to be good. It is how to be good without destroying oneself. The hidden cost of blind goodness is self-betrayal. The path forward is to balance compassion with self-respect, service with authenticity, kindness with truth. Only then do we embody a goodness that is not a cage, but a living force. From childhood, most of us are conditioned to believe that goodness is the ultimate virtue. We are praised when we obey, when we smile politely, when we put the needs of others above our own. Over time, this conditioning shapes not only our behavior, but also our identity. We begin to equate being good with being loved, accepted, and safe. But beneath this seemingly noble pursuit lies a hidden danger. Goodness, when performed out of fear or expectation, becomes nothing more than a mask. It is not a reflection of our authentic self, but a role we play to secure approval and avoid rejection. This mask of goodness may appear harmless on the surface, but it comes at a heavy psychological cost. When we play this role too long, we forget where the mask ends and where we begin. We smile when we are angry, we agree when we want to protest, and we offer kindness when our hearts are breaking. The world sees a person of virtue, yet inside there is often a growing void, a quiet despair that comes from silencing the truth of who we are. Kierkegaard would call this despair the sickness of the soul, a form of self-betrayal born from living for the crowd rather than for one's own authentic existence. The mask of goodness is also deeply rooted in fear. Many people fear that if they were to reveal their true feelings, their true desires, or their true boundaries, they would be judged, rejected, or abandoned, and so they hide behind an image of perfection. They become the peacemaker in every conflict, the giver in every relationship, the one who sacrifices endlessly without ever admitting their own pain. While society often rewards such behavior, praising these individuals as selfless or saintly, the cost is that they feel unseen, because what the world admires is not their true self, but the persona they have carefully constructed. Worse still, the mask of goodness prevents genuine intimacy. If people love us only for our compliance, our kindness, or our constant availability, they do not truly know us. They know the mask, not the person behind it. Real connection requires honesty, and honesty often means showing parts of ourselves that are not always pleasant, agreeable, or good. By conventional standards, by hiding those parts away, we trade authenticity for acceptance, but it is a hollow acceptance that cannot satisfy the soul. Over time, the strain of wearing this mask creates inner conflict. Resentment begins to grow, not only toward others but also toward ourselves. We resent those who take advantage of our goodness, but we also feel guilty for resenting them, since resentment is not good. We find ourselves trapped in a cycle where we suppress anger, then explode, then suppress again. This inner war is exhausting, and it strips life of vitality and joy. The truth is that no human being is purely good. We are complex, filled with contradictions, light and shadow interwoven. To deny this reality is to deny our humanity. The mask of goodness may keep us safe from judgment, but it also keeps us from freedom. Only by removing the mask, by daring to be seen as we truly are, flaws and all, can we step into a life of authenticity. Real goodness arises not from fear or performance, but from the courage to live honestly, even when that honesty makes us imperfect in the eyes of others. The tragedy of always trying to be good is that it makes us vulnerable to exploitation. When our primary concern is to be seen as kind, generous, or accommodating, we often lose the ability to say no. We give more than we can afford to give, we forgive when forgiveness is undeserved, and we accept treatment that diminishes us, all because we believe that goodness requires endless sacrifice. Schopenhauer, with his unflinching view of human nature, would remind us that the world is not filled only with noble intentions. There are those who, consciously or unconsciously, exploit goodness when they see it, because they recognize that the good person is unlikely to resist. The paradox is that society praises such selflessness even as it drains the individual of strength. A person who never complains, who always gives, and who never asserts their own needs is celebrated as virtuous. Yet, behind this celebration lies a cruel reality. Those who take advantage rarely stop to consider the cost to the giver. Goodness, when unbounded, creates an imbalance of power. The one who constantly gives begins to feel invisible, while the one who constantly takes grows accustomed to receiving without gratitude. This dynamic not only depletes the good person's energy, but also corrodes their sense of self-worth. Consider how this plays out in everyday life. In friendships, the good friend is the one who always listens, always shows up, and always supports. Yet when they themselves are in need, they often find silence on the other end. In families, the one who carries the burden of responsibility is often expected to continue doing so, even when it breaks them. In workplaces, employees who sacrifice their time and energy without complaint are rewarded not with respect, but with more demands, because their compliance marks them as easy to exploit. The pattern repeats in countless forms. The more good you are in the conventional sense, the more likely you are to be taken for granted. What makes exploitation so insidious is that it disguises itself as virtue. The good person convinces themselves that their exhaustion is proof of their worth, that their suffering somehow validates their identity as moral or kind, but this is a dangerous illusion. True goodness is not measured by how much of ourselves we allow others to consume. When goodness is divorced from boundaries, it ceases to be noble and becomes destructive, both to the giver, who loses themselves, and to the receiver, who is enabled in their selfishness. Kierkegaard would point out that this dynamic is also a form of despair, because the individual who is exploited clings to the role of the good one, rather than daring to live authentically. They fear that by asserting themselves or saying no, they will lose love and approval. But in truth, they have already lost something far greater, their freedom and their integrity. To break this cycle, one must recognize that goodness without strength is not sustainable. Boundaries are not a betrayal of morality. They are the very condition that makes genuine compassion possible. To be truly good is not to be endlessly available for exploitation, but to give freely from a place of choice, not compulsion. Otherwise, goodness becomes a weakness that others use to their advantage, and the person who wears the mask of virtue ends up hollowed out, unable to live a life that belongs to them. When a person devotes their entire life to being good, in the eyes of others, they often lose touch with their authentic self. What begins as a desire to live virtuously can, over time, turn into a habit of self-denial, where every thought, action, and decision is filtered through the question, will others approve of me if I do this? This way of living erodes authenticity because it replaces inner truth with external validation. Instead of asking, what is true for me, we ask, what will make me acceptable? Kierkegaard would call this the despair of living for the crowd. While Schopenhauer might say it is another way in which the will traps us in endless striving, not for life itself, but for the illusion of goodness. Authenticity requires honesty with oneself. It means acknowledging not only the parts of us that are kind, generous, and moral, but also the parts that are angry, ambitious, fearful, or desiring. Yet in the constant attempt to appear good, these less acceptable parts are pushed into the shadows. We silence our anger because it seems impolite. We deny our ambitions because they seem selfish, and we hide our vulnerabilities because they make us look weak. The problem is that what we suppress does not disappear. Instead, it creates an internal split, leaving us disconnected from our wholeness. We live half a life, a carefully curated performance rather than an authentic existence. The loss of authenticity also creates a profound sense of emptiness. When everything we do is designed to maintain an image of goodness, we eventually realize that no one actually knows who we are beneath the mask. People may admire us for our kindness, respect us for our politeness, or praise us for our sacrifices, but deep down we feel unseen. This invisibility is not because others refuse to see us, but because we never dared to reveal our true selves. What others admire is not us, but the performance of goodness we have perfected. This recognition is devastating because it reveals the cost of people pleasing. We may gain approval, but at the price of intimacy and authenticity. Furthermore, the loss of authenticity diminishes our ability to make choices that truly serve us. Instead of pursuing paths aligned with our values and desires, we pursue what is expected. We may choose careers that please our families, relationships that make us look respectable, or lifestyles that conform to societal ideals of virtue. But beneath these choices lies dissatisfaction, because they were not born from our authentic will, but from the demand to be good. This is why many wake up one day, exhausted and unfulfilled, realizing they have lived for everyone else but themselves. Kierkegaard insisted that true goodness arises when one stands before God, or existence itself, in full honesty, not when one hides behind the crowd's applause. To be authentic means to live in alignment with our deepest truth, even when that truth does not look conventionally good. Schopenhauer, though more pessimistic, would agree that the illusion of goodness binds us to unnecessary suffering, because it keeps us striving endlessly for approval we will never fully secure. The irony is that authenticity, though often messy and imperfect, creates a more genuine form of goodness than the mask ever could. When we live truthfully, our kindness becomes real rather than performative, and our compassion flows from sincerity rather than fear. By reclaiming authenticity, we move from living as a hollow good person to living as a whole human being, flawed, complex, and alive. When we constantly strive to be good in the eyes of others, we often bury our anger, frustration, and resentment deep within ourselves. On the surface, we smile, comply, and present a version of ourselves that seems kind and agreeable. But beneath this mask, the emotions we suppress begin to fester. Schopenhauer argued that suppression of natural instincts and desires inevitably creates suffering, because the will cannot be silenced. It merely turns inward, twisting itself into bitterness. Kierkegaard, too, would warn that when we live in denial of our true feelings, despair takes root. Thus, the attempt to always be good does not eliminate negativity, it transforms it into resentment. resentment arises because the constant sacrifice of one's authentic needs in favor of pleasing others creates an imbalance. Imagine always giving up your time, energy, or desires for the sake of being agreeable. At first, it may feel noble, even virtuous, but over time, the self feels neglected, unvalued, and invisible. You begin to ask, why do others not see my sacrifices? Why is my goodness not repaid with the same devotion? The silent expectation that others will reward our goodness leads to disappointment because true human relationships are never perfectly reciprocal. This disappointment, left unspoken, curdles into resentment. The problem is that resentment rarely expresses itself directly. Since we are still clinging to the image of being good, we cannot openly admit our anger or bitterness. Instead, it leaks out indirectly. We may become passive, aggressive, withdrawing affection, withholding honesty, or secretly judging those we serve. We may complain inwardly but remain silent outwardly, which creates a split between how we act and how we truly feel. This hidden hostility corrodes relationships because it turns acts of kindness into veiled obligations. What should be free expressions of love or generosity become poisoned with expectation and unspoken rage. Moreover, resentment does not remain confined to specific situations. Once the pattern of suppressing one's truth becomes a way of life, resentment becomes a lens through which we see the world. We begin to feel exploited everywhere, at work, in friendships, in family life. Even if others are not consciously taking advantage of us, the world starts to appear as a place where we are always giving but never receiving, always bending but never being supported. Schopenhauer would say this is yet another form of the suffering inherent in life, intensified by our insistence on wearing the mask of virtue. Kierkegaard might describe it as despair masquerading as morality, a sickness of the soul caused by refusing to be honest about our needs and boundaries. The tragic irony is that resentment makes us less good than we intended to be. The very attempt to maintain an image of flawless virtue corrupts our spirit, leaving us bitter, judgmental, and secretly hostile. We may still act good on the surface, but our goodness no longer springs from love. It is rooted in duty, resentment, and fear. True goodness requires freedom, sincerity, and balance. Without these, even the noblest gestures are hollow, and the soul becomes heavy with suppressed rage. Only when we confront this hidden resentment, acknowledge our anger, and set boundaries can we escape this trap. Being good does not mean pleasing everyone at the cost of ourselves. It means acting from authenticity. By honoring both our kindness and our anger, we prevent resentment from taking root, and we discover a form of goodness that is not poisoned by self-denial but strengthened by truth. The pursuit of always being good eventually leads to exhaustion because it demands that a person maintain an impossible standard. To be good in the eyes of everyone means to constantly monitor yourself, suppress certain impulses, and adjust your behavior to match what others expect. This is not a momentary effort but a lifelong burden, and over time it drains energy, creativity, and joy. Schopenhauer, who saw life as saturated with suffering, would argue that the relentless effort to appear virtuous only adds another layer of pain to existence. Kierkegaard would call this a form of despair, where life is spent trying to satisfy an image of goodness rather than living authentically. This exhaustion stems from the endless need to perform. To always be good, one must constantly calculate what to say, how to act, and even how to feel. Authentic emotions are filtered through a mental screen. Is this acceptable? Will this make me seem kind? Will others approve? Over time, this self-surveillance becomes suffocating because it leaves no room for spontaneity. Instead of living freely, one is living like an actor rehearsing for a play that never ends. The cost of this performance is immense. It robs the individual of inner peace and breeds anxiety, because no matter how much effort is poured into maintaining goodness, there is always the possibility of slipping, of failing, of being exposed as not good enough. Moreover, the exhaustion is not only emotional but also physical. A life spent in constant self-restraint wears down the body as much as the mind. Stress builds from never being able to relax into one's natural state. Even leisure time becomes work, because the performance of goodness does not end when one leaves the office or the social gathering. It follows everywhere, in the tone of voice, in the choice of words, in the smallest gestures. This vigilance is draining, leaving the individual perpetually tired yet unable to stop, because the fear of disapproval or rejection is stronger than the need for rest. What makes this exhaustion more dangerous is that it is often invisible. From the outside, the good person may look composed, polite, and reliable. People may praise them for their patience, their generosity, or their dedication. Yet inside, the person feels depleted, running on an empty reservoir of energy and spirit. They may smile, while secretly resenting the effort it takes to maintain that smile. This hidden exhaustion can lead to burnout, depression, or a deep sense of futility. Schopenhauer might call it the inevitable suffering of life, multiplied by our own illusions, while Kierkegaard would see it as despair hidden behind a mask of virtue. Eventually, the individual may reach a breaking point where the weight of goodness becomes unbearable. This collapse can manifest in different ways: sudden anger outbursts, withdrawal from relationships, or a quiet but devastating sense of meaninglessness. Ironically, the more one tries to be good, the more fragile one becomes, because the effort is unsustainable. True strength cannot come from endless performance. It must come from authenticity. To overcome this exhaustion, one must realize that perfection is neither possible nor necessary. Goodness is not about flawless conduct, but about honesty, balance, and humanity. By embracing imperfections, by allowing ourselves to be real rather than ideal, we free ourselves from the exhausting cycle of performance. Kierkegaard's insight reminds us that the self can only rest when it stands in truth, not when it hides in appearances. And Schopenhauer's philosophy suggests that relief comes not from striving endlessly, but from letting go of illusions and accepting life as it is. Only then can we replace exhaustion with peace and false goodness with authentic being. When a person dedicates their life to always being good, they often lose their individuality in the process. The desire to be seen as virtuous, polite, or morally correct requires a kind of self-erasure, because individuality is not neat, polished, or universally acceptable. It is messy, contradictory, and sometimes offensive to others, but the pursuit of goodness, as society defines it, demands conformity. It requires us to silence what is unique, complex, or difficult about ourselves in favor of what is safe and approved. Schopenhauer would say this is the will bending under external illusions, while Kierkegaard would see it as despair, a refusal to be oneself for fear of disapproval. Individuality thrives on authenticity, creativity, and self-expression. Yet, when we are consumed by the need to appear good, these qualities become stifled. We do not speak our true thoughts for fear they may sound harsh. We do not pursue unconventional dreams for fear they may seem selfish. We do not show our raw emotions for fear they may be judged as weakness or anger. Slowly, piece by piece, the self is trimmed down until what remains is not a full human being but a hollow role. We become a reflection of others' expectations rather than an embodiment of our own essence. The loss of individuality is especially dangerous because it is often praised. Society rewards conformity disguised as virtue. People who always say yes, who never challenge authority, who sacrifice their desires for others, are often admired as noble, selfless, or pure. Yet behind this praise lies a tragedy, the death of individuality. A life lived only to satisfy others' standards is not truly lived at all. Kierkegaard warned that the greatest despair is to not will to be oneself, to hide behind the mask of the crowd. And indeed, when one loses individuality in the pursuit of being good, despair quietly takes root. This loss also creates inner conflict. Deep within, the self longs to express its uniqueness, to create, to rebel, to feel deeply, to live boldly. But the demand to always be good forces these impulses into silence. This conflict does not disappear. It simply becomes unconscious, manifesting as anxiety, dissatisfaction, or even self-hatred. The individual may not understand why they feel empty or restless, but it is because their individuality has been buried under the weight of goodness. They have traded their soul for approval, and the soul resists such a bargain. Furthermore, when individuality is lost, relationships suffer. Others may interact with the good version of us, but not with our true selves. This creates distance and shallowness because intimacy requires authenticity. People cannot love us for who we are if we are never willing to show them. Thus, the attempt to be good robs us not only of individuality, but also of genuine human connection. The remedy is to embrace the parts of ourselves that do not always appear good. To reclaim individuality, we must allow ourselves to be imperfect, to hold unpopular opinions, to make mistakes, to follow desires that others may not understand. Schopenhauer would call this a liberation from illusion, while Kierkegaard would call it the leap into authentic existence. It is only by daring to live as ourselves, flawed and complex, that we regain individuality. True goodness does not require the loss of self. It requires the courage to live authentically, even if that means being misunderstood. The paradox of always trying to be good is that, instead of creating more goodness in the world, it often produces harm, both to oneself and to others. On the surface, the effort to be virtuous seems noble, but when it is rooted in fear, suppression, and the denial of one's true self, it leads to outcomes that are anything but good. Schopenhauer would say that this is yet another example of how the will deceives us, trapping us in endless striving for illusions. Kierkegaard would argue that this is despair disguised as morality, where one's existence is emptied of truth and replaced with hollow appearances. The harm begins with the self, by denying authentic emotions, desires, and needs in the name of appearing good. A person wounds their own psyche. This inner split creates suffering, resentment, anxiety, exhaustion, and despair. A person may look generous, patient, or saint-like, but internally they are burdened, bitter, and drained. This dissonance leads to self-destruction as the individual sacrifices wholeness for approval. In attempting to embody goodness, they lose balance, integrity, and vitality. What could have been a life of authenticity becomes a performance, leaving the self fragmented and incomplete. But the harm does not stop at the self. The goodness that arises from fear and suppression is rarely genuine. It often carries hidden expectations or unspoken bitterness. For instance, a person may give endlessly to others but secretly resent them for not reciprocating. Their kindness becomes a weapon of guilt, their generosity a demand for recognition. Relationships built on such false goodness are fragile because they are not rooted in honesty but in manipulation. The irony is that the pursuit of being good often undermines the very relationships it aims to protect. Instead of intimacy, it creates distance. Instead of trust, it breeds tension. On a broader scale, the obsession with goodness also reinforces conformity and stagnation in society. When individuals silence their authentic voices to appear virtuous, society loses the benefit of diverse perspectives, creativity, and courage. Great change often comes from those willing to disrupt the norm, to speak uncomfortable truths, or to act in ways that may not look good in the eyes of the crowd. By always striving for approval, individuals contribute to the preservation of unjust systems, enabling oppression and mediocrity under the guise of virtue. Kierkegaard warned of this. The crowd's morality can blind individuals to deeper truths, leaving them obedient but spiritually dead. Perhaps the deepest harm is spiritual. When goodness is pursued as performance, it disconnects us from real morality. True goodness is not about appearances, but about authenticity, courage, and integrity. It emerges not from fear of judgment, but from alignment with one's inner truth. By denying this truth in order to appear good, we create a counterfeit morality that harms more than it heals. The paradox, then, is clear. In trying to be endlessly good, one may become less good, resentful, manipulative, hollow, or complicit in injustice. The remedy is not to abandon goodness altogether, but to redefine it. Real goodness requires the courage to be authentic, even when it does not look perfect. It requires imperfection, honesty, and the willingness to face disapproval for the sake of truth. As Kierkegaard would say, it is in becoming a self and daring to live one's individuality before God or existence that true goodness is born. And as Schopenhauer might add, it is only by freeing ourselves from the illusion of endless striving that we can live with genuine compassion, grounded not in performance, but in reality.